Lynn, did you see any of the European Athletic Championships that were on TV recently?
No,
Are you are you an athletics or sports fan?
I like swimming and tennis and Aussie rules football, but I wouldn't say I'm an active follower.
No, me neither. It just happened to be on the TV, and I watched the men's 10,000-meter race, which I think is about 6 miles. And I was literally astounded by, I think his name is Andreas Almgren. Sorry if I've pronounced that incorrectly. He was running for Sweden, and he ended up breaking, I think, the 1978 championship record by running that distance in 27 minutes, just over. And he just played it so cool. And I thought, how on earth? I can't even run up the stairs. But it just got me thinking about the analogy that we sometimes use to describe singers as athletes and how we even compare to somebody like Andreas Almgren or any of the other participants in athletics. So, when did you first hear the term vocal athlete or singers are athletes?
I definitely remember hearing the term vocal athlete, singers as athletes, not sort of has maybe more recent, but I would say in the early teens, a book came out called The Vocal Athlete. And I remember seeing the title and going, yeah, that's true. We use our vocal folds in the same way that an athlete uses their body. Yeah, so I remember that resonating with me. So that was the first time that I came across that concept. And then I think I probably heard other people starting to talk about it at various conferences and workshops and masterclasses that I attended.
And of course, since then, we've had Andrew Burns' The Singing Athlete, which came out in 2020. And in his book, he starts by asking a question: how would it feel to call yourself an athlete? Would it make you proud or uncomfortable, excited, ashamed? And then he goes on to say how in his Singing Athlete course, he's had pretty much all of these responses. Have you come across any responses when you've referred to singers as athletes from either singers themselves or other teachers?
I don't think I've ever referred to a performer as an athlete. I've maybe referred to the fact that they're using their voice like an athlete would use, their body. So they're a vocal athlete. I've definitely spoken in that way. And I don't remember any resistance to that concept. And in fact, I think quite often it put across the point of the fact that they needed to think about their voice in a different way to just ordinary use, when they're in the context of performing and singing. So I use it in that context of helping to emphasize that we're not using our voice in an ordinary way, everyday way. We are using it in an exceptional way that needs more care and understanding and training. Yeah, so it's generally been favorable.
If we look up the definition, and it always makes me laugh when somebody starts with the Cambridge Dictionary definition of, but we must look at what the definition is. And it says in the Cambridge Dictionary that an athlete is a person who is very good at sports or physical exercise, especially one who competes in organised events. So from that, a singer quite clearly isn't an athlete based on that definition. So what exactly are we comparing, and why is it that powerful analogy at times?
I think it's in terms of the extreme use of the instrument or the biomechanics that's going on in the voice, whether that's the intrinsic and extrinsic muscles or the precision with which we have to focus the use of the biomechanics of our voice, maybe also the concentration. There's a lot of things happening at once. And of course, if you're talking about someone who performs, say, in musical theatre, there may be some physical activities that they have to do, fighting, running around, Actually, even if you talk about people who are arena performers, they're often running around on huge stages, up and down sets and stairs and swinging from things. If you're talking about Pink, she's quite well known for her use of acrobatics and circus type trapeze things, isn't it? And that requires physical training, but that would be separate to the voice. Yeah, so I suppose we could correlate those things. And singers do compete. There are competitions that you have to prepare for, and you're focused on one particular song or genre, maybe in that scenario, which is not that different to an athlete. They're categorized. It's a little bit more, I suppose, in the classical and musical theatre worlds. But beyond that, I'm not sure. And certainly in terms of how people approach training, I'm not seeing as close a correlation because in the sports world, it's totally acceptable and expected that you have a coach and a trainer and that you spend time coaching and training, not only on the actual sport that you're doing and the actions that you need to do for that sport, but getting the whole of your body and your mind ready to do that activity. Yeah. So I think there are correlations, but there's also a lot of differences.
As you were mentioning just now about Pink, it reminded me of a conversation we had with Mindy Pack, who's working with some artists who she says are basically completing a half marathon when they're doing performances at night. And we only have to look at people like Harry Styles and his current tour, where the stage, I think, comes out into the crowd and he's running around that thing night after night. And he has to be really physically fit. So I guess in the terms of an artist like them being physically ready, we could liken it to an athlete. And like athletes, we can't get away from the fact that we're using our bodies at the end of the night, like a saxophonist or a guitar player. You know, they have their own things to deal with, I'm sure. But we're using that all the time. So we're thinking about sleep regimes and diet and well-being and all of those things as well.
Yeah, I remember my friend Dinosh Bennett and also Rob Stevenson telling me when they worked with Justin Timberlake that they would have to get into the gym and get fit before they went on tour, otherwise they couldn't make it through the first night because it was so physical. And, you know, the stages, especially at that level, are very large and there's usually, you know, a lot of running around. Sometimes you have to go off stage and run around to the other side to come on, you know, in time for the next bit that you're involved in. I remember seeing Dinosh running up and down these spiral staircases as she's singing and in high heels as well. So if you aren't fit and ready for those kind of gigs, it can be quite difficult to get through. But of course, most singers aren't working at that level at the end of the day. And I think it does depend on the context. Having said that, the more physically fit you are, the better you're able to support everything that you need to do on when you're performing, regardless of whether you're on an arena stage or throwing furniture around in the West End.
I was reading an article recently by Jan Sebastian Thomser for Sport in Art, which was about why is opera singing so physically demanding that it's often compared to athletic competition. And in it, he was interviewing a couple of singers who were also quite interested in sport. And one of the singers' names was Pavel Stayskull, who said that when I sing, my heart rate rises to the level of a light run. And that is during lessons, not performances. A full opera is equivalent to an athletic race because besides singing, you also have to act, often quite intensely. And the writer himself, the journalist, summarizes how, in short, the common denominator between opera and sport is the demand for both physical and mental energy at the highest level. But lots of occupations are physically and mentally demanding. So what makes it athletic?
I think for me, the implication is honing in on this one thing that you do and everything else that you do to prepare and get your body and your mind ready for it is focused in on that. I'm not sure that an accountant would necessarily have to do all that physical preparation to do their job. Maybe when I think back to nursing days, we probably could have done with a little bit more weightlifting, but other jobs, there isn't that thought about, what do you eat, how much you drink, what you're doing with your body and your voice before and after, physically, how fit you are, actually training on a regular daily basis, to do your job. So maybe that's the distinction.
And then, but then I'm thinking about esports. My husband is a big gamer, and so he was getting quite excited that something was happening with Dota 2. He loves that. But it's called esports. But when I go into his room and he is watching these championships, the participants are sat at a computer clicking away. And that's not to disregard them at all, because there's a lot of attention on it and people are really invested. But that's called a sport. How does that become a sport and singing doesn't, let's say?
I can't answer that one.
Me neither. I just like The Sims. And Snake. Do you remember Snake?
No.
On the old 9210 or whatever it was called, on the old Nokias, where it was literally this pixelated worm that you just had to get round and get the food, and if they bumped into itself on the way around, you died. And honestly, addictive.
I'm from the day of Space Invaders and Pac-Man, and yeah, that's mine. And Tetris.
You recently wrote a really interesting Substack article on this topic, and it's with the line, "The singer as a vocal athlete analogy is useful, but it's not the whole picture, especially in performing arts medicine." And in it, you write, "A sprinter will never intentionally run with poor form, but an actor singer may be required to sustain poor form for 2 or more hours as part of the performance itself." So where does this analogy actually fall down?
So this started when I was putting together a series of lectures for the Performing Arts Medicine Association and the course that they run for clinicians who want to understand performing arts better. So I was focused on breath management, and I was thinking about, like I was referring to earlier, people like Pink and some of the actors and what they have to do in musical theatre shows, costumes they have to wear, positions that they have to hold, and how that's impacting their breathing and their breath management. And I was sitting there thinking, so these are really abnormal things. Like if you were the Hunchback of Notre Dame, yes, okay, you might have a costume that's got the hunchback lump in it, but you still need to walk in a particular way. You probably do still stoop over. And if you're playing the role of Lord Farquaad in Shrek, you've got to do that on your knees for the entire show. And I was like, okay, so that's really abnormal. That's, for me, one of the main difference between thinking about sport athletes, and if we think about performers as athletes, we're not always aiming for optimum position, optimum singing, optimum movement, which is what you would do in sport. We are sometimes having to work around these poor postures and also even compromise our voice to a certain extent. For instance, you might have to yell a lot as part of the character. Now, I think about Elphaba, for instance. She's always angry throughout the show, and she's got to belt all these high notes, and she's got to be on a harness and floating around and flying, all of those things. And somehow she's got to breathe properly or support herself. It's like, they're just trying to support their spine, let alone their singing. So maybe athlete isn't the right word, because in my mind, an athlete is always working for perfection or optimizing whatever they're doing, making it as good as it can be. Whereas a singer or a performer might not necessarily be doing that, either because that's what's required of the role or that's what's happening when they're on stage. For instance, if you're running around a big stage in an outside setting and it's raining, you're now having to deal with elements that aren't part of, the perfect scenario of or setting of performance. And you're expected to continue. I mean, and I've seen many, many outdoor gigs where people have continued to perform in the rain.
There's been videos recently, I think, of Harry Styles in Mexico, and he slips on the stage, but he styles out very well. He's just very cool.
He slipped in a stylish way.
He did.
He made slipping look cool.
Yeah.
Beyonce slipped, Rihanna slipped. I'm sure many people have slipped. I think Robert Plant came off the stage at one point and broke his leg. Was it Robert Plant or David Matthews? One of those rock singers.
Oh, yeah. Dave Grohl.
Dave Grohl, yes. They're all in the same kind of arena. Yeah, so, and he broke his leg falling over off the stage. So the environment is potentially dangerous, in terms of if we look at it from an occupational health point of view. But then also it might be that your vocal style or, if you're Sex Pistols, you're not going to be singing perfectly. If you're Courtney Love, you're not singing perfectly. That's the whole point. That's their sound. And unfortunately, it will have an impact eventually on the vocal health. And that's sort of all the physicals aside. Yeah.
It would be a little bit like the athlete we were talking about in the beginning, Andreas from Sweden, running that 10,000 meter race in a pair of like ski boots or in an animal costume or something. It just wouldn't happen, would it?
Having said that, a friend of mine is a designer for sportswear, and it's not as bespoke to the sport as you might think, even at the Olympics level. But for most of the time, they have outfits that suit what they need to do, for sure. And the environment's set up to reduce the possibility of accidents or things going wrong. That's not to say that it might not. I mean, any athlete can fall over or end up having some sort of error happen during the process of the actions that they do, for sure, but they're not aiming to do that. I think that's part of the difference.
I'm just pressing the pause button on the podcast for a very brief moment to invite you to book your free BAST call. If you've been thinking about joining the BAST community through one of our courses, but you just don't know which option is the best for you, then why not book your free Zoom chat with our very own Kimberly George, who has all the answers. Head over to basttraining.com/book-a-call/ and click that big blue button. That's basttraining.com/book-a-call/. Now, where were we?
I remember in one of my contracts, I had to wear a dress that was corseted, so it was really tight. I had this big headdress on. The shoes that I had been given were 2 sizes too small, and we had to waltz while singing in harmony. I mean, it was for a very, very small part of the show, so it didn't have too much of an impact on me in the long run. But I thought, this is the most uncomfortable thing, having to do this, particularly with the shoes. And to be fair, the shoes that I wore for the entire couple of years on the contract, we had to do lots of things to stretch out the leather and do all the, like, kind of break them in a little bit because they were so uncomfortable.
That really shocked me when I went backstage at Radio City in New York, and I saw this whole row of all these different shoes. And I don't know what question I asked, but the response was, oh no, they just get whatever shoes they get given. And this is dancers for whom this is their profession. And I was like, so they're dancing potentially in shoes that don't fit their feet properly? And she said, yeah, it's just part of the deal. I was quite shocked at that. And it's the same with, if you come in to work on a show, or I don't know, say it's a tribute show of some sort. They're always looking for people that can fit into the costumes because they can't really afford to change the costume size every time a different sized person comes in. And if you don't fit in, you don't get the gig, or, you know, you get the costume and you just have to make do with wearing it the best you can. The other thing too that I mean, aside from the shoes thing, you know, dancing and singing in heels, especially if you've never done it before, totally changes your posture, which will have an impact on your larynx. There's also the possibility in, especially in musical theatre, where you might have maybe two receivers under your wig, because especially if you're a lead, the first one's, you know, the one that's been used, and the second one's your backup in case the first one doesn't work. So not only have you got some sort of headdress or wig on your head that you've got to contend with and figure out how to balance on your body, but now you've got two receivers sitting in there as well. And all of this stuff just doesn't get taken into account when helping a singer adjust and do the job that they need to do. It's expected. You will make adjustments, and if you don't, well, see you later. Someone else will come and do it. Or you end up suffering, you know, and injuring yourself.
There is a good podcast that we have with Jenny Morton a few years back now, where she actually takes us through an exercise of how to re-find our neutral, which I think would be really cool for us to take into our lessons and help people who are in these scenarios and say after the show, this is how we can re-find your neutral again, so that we can hopefully minimize or reduce possible habits coming in.
Yeah.
Another thing that we talk about quite a lot is the perception of injury in the sports world compared to the performance world. Thankfully, I think more people are coming out and sharing when they've had some difficulties themselves. You know, Megan Hilty on Broadway come out and said that she needed to take a break. Do you feel that's changing now a little bit, or do you feel we're still in the same sticking point?
No, I do think it is changing. Certainly in the sports world, if someone has a knee injury, which is, I guess, the most common injury in sports, everybody goes, well, yeah, sure, you know, kind of expected. They'll go off, have the surgery, do the rehab, get back into training, and be back in a year or two, and it's accepted. Somehow in the singing world, it's seen as a failure if you end up with injury or something going wrong with your voice and you having to take time off. I think with the major artists, you know, people like Adele's talked about it, Miley Cyrus has talked about it. In fact, Miley made a point about the fact that given the fact that this was how she was making the money for the big corp, obviously the label she's talking about, there should have been someone teaching her how to look after her voice, maintain longevity, and also time off should have been considered. So in the opera world, no opera house would allow a singer to go on 6, 7, 8 times a week. It's only one or two, and there's always days rest in between. But if you're a contemporary artist and if you're working in musical theatre, you're expected to be going on as often, you know, as you're expected, whether it's 8 shows a week or 5 shows plus moving from one town to another and sleeping on a bus and all those things. So that's not necessarily going to help and support the performer's voice and their body to do the job.
I used to really enjoy watching A League of Their Own, even though I don't really follow sports, but I watched it for the comedy. And when they had a sports personality come on, if they were playing these games, running obstacle courses, sometimes that personality would be removed from the game to protect them from injury amongst a season or a competition coming up. I don't say that, you know, sports personalities don't have other things to do if they're working with brands and doing interviews and things, but that's just an example of that. They're not made to then perform, whereas a performer would probably have to go on TV and sing outside of their contracted hours.
Yeah, so I think in my article I was talking about the cast from Hamilton going out and performing a song somewhere in New York. It might have been in Times Square, and it was, I think, snowing. It was very cold, so they've got to do that during the day, and then they're off, doing the performance that evening, and they may have done the performance the evening before. That's pretty full on. Like, you wouldn't expect someone who was going out to play a football match to go and play football at lunchtime and then go and play the match in the evening. You might be warming up and getting ready for the match, but you wouldn't be going out and playing another match, Though I think there are some times when you have to do a particular sport maybe more than once on a day, but you would be preparing for that, the whole way. Whereas with performers, it's just expected. You'll do performances around your regular performance. You'll do interviews where you're using your voice. You might have to go do voiceover stuff. Obviously, at some point, you might be going and doing a sound check, which you may or may not be using your voice. And there's so many musical theatre performers who are, especially at the end of the run of a show, starting to rehearse a new show. So they're rehearsing the new show during the day, and then in the evening they're going out and doing the old show. So that kind of activity is not taken into account. And of course, because there's this fear of not having a job tomorrow, people will just go out and take whatever.
This might be splitting hairs, Lynn, but I'm going to split them anyway. For episode 61, nuts that was so long ago, we're in the 270s now, we spoke with Anna Flavia Zuin, who was doing some really interesting studies about measuring vocal load in contemporary musical theatre. I'd need to go back and remind myself in depth about what that study was, but what I remember is she was measuring, I think, vocal fold vibration or activity on singers who were performing in, I think it was university level, Wonderland, the Frank Wildhorn musical. And it came about that the females, the 3 identifying females who were measured, had travelled an equivalent of 3 miles or 5.2 kilometres or something, more than the male identifying measurements. I think I'm just thinking about the language, like when we say this is equivalent to crossing this amount of distance, well, the singer isn't crossing that amount of distance in reality. So what if the language was singer A phonated for this percentage of their working day, or singer B had this many vibration cycles, which is this equivalent to a washing machine? I mean, it's all a bit much, but is our idea of the vocal athlete influenced by the language that we're using to describe the way we measure singers, or what do you think?
There's a couple of things I wanted to bring up here. It's interesting, isn't it, how much more the vocal folds a female identifying person will.
In that musical anyway.
But in general, it'll be like that because obviously females sing higher frequencies. And what a lot of singers don't understand is that if you're singing a higher note, there's a higher amount of times your vocal folds are coming together. So Dr. Steve Zeitels, who is an ENT laryngologist in the States, he did a documentary with Steve Tyler, who's the singer from Aerosmith. And he said at one point, oh yes, on any given night, Steve's vocal folds will come together at least 1 million times. And I think whatever it takes for someone to get the fact that the vocal folds are working under exceptional conditions and abnormal conditions, I suppose, to certainly not, it's not like speaking. Your vocal folds will not come together that many times during a normal day of speaking. And it's because we're singing these higher frequencies. So the higher frequencies will require the vocal folds to adduct or come together more often. And Anna's study is a great way of measuring that. And the thing is with science, you've got to figure out how do we measure this, make it tangible, make it something that's data that we can then translate into some interpretation. That's probably the reason why that study existed, because it's all very well hypothesizing that probably Steve Tyler's vocal folds came together that many times in a night, but where's the proof, and I think science is always looking for evidence. So it is useful from that point of view, even though it sounds very convoluted and complicated. And part of the role of our scientists is to help translate it into a useful measure and interpretation for the person who's actually affected. So if somebody can relate to, well, if you go out and do this performance and you're singing in this range and you're singing for this amount of time, your vocal folds will do the equivalent of X amount of mileage or kilometers, or come together X amount of times each time, or equate to a certain weight, then that's relatable for a singer. And you also need to have a comparison of, so what happens during a normal day? What happens with a teacher? What happens with somebody who works from home and doesn't talk to anyone else? So you've got these different measures, and then you can say, oh, okay, I can see how that compares and where what I'm doing fits into it. It also means that at some later stage, if we're having to communicate to a performer, you need to reduce what you're doing. You've got a measurable way of helping them understand that. So that's how these kind of studies become useful, but they always need to be translated into a practical, useful measure and into language as well, as you said, that can be related to by the people for whom this matters.
So where does this leave the term vocal athlete then? Or are we just making mountains out of molehills?
Well, I don't think we'd be us if we didn't explore that. I think that the term vocal athlete does serve us in as much as helping a singer understand that what they're doing is not ordinary. It's not day to day. It's something different. It's a skill set. It requires training, looking after, nourishing, supporting, whatever. In terms of, are we athletes? I'm not so sure, but maybe, like often happens with language, it might mean that the term athlete morphs into a slightly different meaning, as often words do. And as far as I can see right now, there isn't any other way to help people understand why what we do as singers and performers is not every day. It's not just magically appearing from nowhere. It's not just because somebody may or may not have been born with or worked on their skill set. It requires ongoing work, ongoing maintenance. It requires correction at times. It requires recovery and training and coaching. Other things are going to support it, whether that's our physical fitness or our nutritional and hydration conditions. I think in terms of using that terminology to help people understand that, I find it really useful. But whether or not we can see ourselves as sports people, I'm not sure that a lot of performers want to. Because it's we're creative. And that's not to say that sports isn't creative at all, but I feel like maybe we need to understand more, rather than using an analogy or a term that comes from another field, is to actually just say, actually being a performer is like being an athlete, is like being a consultant doctor. There's a certain amount of time, energy, effort, skill, and talent that goes into being a performer, and it needs to be regarded as a serious job. And certainly, from my point of view of the performing arts medical side of things, being taken seriously, being understood in its own field. Yeah. So I think in terms of helping craft a better dialogue around performers and health and well-being, I think it's important. Whether or not the analogy of being an athlete is where we want to stick, I'm not so sure. I would like really for being a performer to be taken more seriously out there in the world.
Well, I think you rounded us off really well there, Lynn.
Well, thanks for bringing out the topic, because it's definitely one that is my favourite area of concentration.
Well, thanks for joining me today, Lynn, and I'll see you on the next one. Love you.
Thank you. Bye.